Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Friday, July 21st, 2023. A federal judge rules the trial of former President Donald Trump in the classified documents case will begin May of 2024. We'll have more on that in a moment. Vice President Kamala Harris speaks in Florida about that state's newly adopted African American history teaching standards. We'll also hear from members of the Florida Board of Education about why they changed the curriculum. President Joe Biden gets commitments from technology companies on artificial intelligence development to, as he puts it, manage the risks. Secretary of State Antony Blinken talks about the news of more U.S. top officials' email accounts hacked by a group based in China. United Nations Security Council holds an emergency meeting on Russia's withdrawal this week from the UN agreement to allow grain exports from Ukraine. And British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's Conservative Party loses 2 out of 3 special elections for seats in Parliament. We'll talk with C-SPAN's producer in London, Peter Knowles, on where the Prime Minister stands politically, heading into Parliament's August recess this year and next year's general election. And now a little more on the trial of former President Donald Trump in the federal case where he's charged with keeping illegally classified documents. Associated Press reports the May 20, 2024 trial date, set Friday by U.S. District Judge Aileen Cannon, is a compromise between a request from prosecutors to set the trial for this December and a bid by defense lawyers to schedule it after the 2024 presidential election. Judge Cannon wrote that the government's proposed schedule is atypically accelerated and inconsistent with ensuring a fair trial. She agreed with defense lawyers that the amount of evidence that would need to be sifted through before the trial, including classified information, was voluminous. And Judge Cannon wrote, the court finds that the interests of justice served by this continuance outweigh the best interests of the public and defendants in a speedy trial. Vice President Kamala Harris in Jacksonville, Florida today, talking about the Florida Board of Education's adoption this week of Florida's Black History Education Standards. CNN reports the new standards require instruction for middle school students to include how slaves developed skills which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit. A document listing the standards and posted in the Florida Department of Education website said, when high school students learn about events such as the 1920 Ocoee Massacre, the new rules require that instruction include acts of violence perpetrated against and by African Americans. Here's Vice President Kamala Harris.
When adults know what slavery really involved, come on. Adults know what slavery really involved. It involved rape. It involved torture. It involved taking a baby from their mother. It involved some of the worst examples of depriving people of humanity in our world. It involves subjecting to people the requirement that they would think of themselves and be thought of as less than human. So in the context of that, how is it that anyone could suggest that in the midst of these atrocities, that there was any benefit to being subjected to this level of dehumanization? In the midst of these atrocities, that there was some benefit. So it is not only misleading, it is false, and it is pushing propaganda. People who walk around and want to be praised as leaders, who want to be talked about as American leaders, pushing propaganda on our children. Pushing propaganda on our children.
Vice President Kamala Harris today in Jacksonville, Florida. An AP story has this. Christian Ziegler, chair of the Florida Republican Party, said Vice President Harris was ignoring problems at the U.S. border with Mexico to, quote, lecture Floridian parents that their children belong to the government and the government has a right to indoctrinate and sexualize our children. He said the government overreach on parental rights has already been overwhelmingly rejected in Florida. The Florida Board of Education met Wednesday in Orlando. Here's part of the meeting with the board chair Ben Gibson and member Manny Diaz talking about the changes to African American history curriculum.
Anyone who can read these standards, you can see the topics that are covered are in depth, and there's nothing that is left out. And I think Dr. Burns, when the work group first got together, there was even some skepticism as to what would be kept in, and what has been kept in, so for the information of this board, is everything that work group put together. So what they produce was cleaned up from a stylistic standpoint to make sure there were no typos, and we did add some stuff, but nothing was removed, including what we continue to say, it's the good, the bad, and the ugly in American history. And so I think if you look at this standard right here, you can see clearly, I think that answers the question as to, is anything covered up?
Yeah, and right, so this right here, what we're looking at, benchmark clarifications, clarification 1, instruction includes the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping on individual freedoms. For example, the civil rights cases, black codes, Jim Crow laws, lynchings, Columbian Exposition of 1893, includes acts of violence perpetrated against and by African Americans, but is not limited to the 1906 Atlanta race riot, 1919 Washington, D.C. race riot, 1920 Ocoee massacre, 1921 Tulsa massacre, and the 1923 Rosewood massacre. And it includes instruction on African American communities as well, including, of course, Edenville, Florida, not too far from here.
Right, and if you look at that, Mr. Chair, if you look at the entirety of the standards, what was put together, it allows for, number one, age appropriate. So when we're talking about a very young student, we talk about prominent African Americans, and that includes from artists to inventors to President Obama. And as it becomes more age appropriate, we start to go into the tougher subjects. And when you get into high school, it goes all the way back and examines where slavery starts, the slave trade in Africa, what occurs, how it comes to America, because at the end of the day, African American history is American history. And so this is, again, I want to commend Dr. Burns and his work with the work group, the task force, and all his team, because I think this is something that's going to set the norm for standards in other states when it comes to African American history.
Manny Diaz, a commissioner on the Florida Board of Education. You also heard from the chair, Ben Gibson, at the meeting on Wednesday in Orlando, where the new teaching standards for African American history were adopted. The new standards come about because of a 2022 Florida law titled the Stop Woke Act, signed by Governor Ron DeSantis, now a Republican presidential candidate, that requires discussions about race be taught in an objective manner and that students not be made to feel guilty for actions taken in the past by people of their same race or origin. This is Washington Today. President Joe Biden announcing today that 7 large technology companies leading the way on artificial intelligence have agreed to voluntary safeguards on AI development. Those 7 companies are Amazon, Anthropic, Google, Inflection, Meta, Microsoft, and OpenAI. President Biden spoke at the White House.
These commitments, which the companies will implement immediately, underscore 3 fundamental principles: safety, security, and trust. First, the companies have an obligation to make sure their technology is safe before releasing it to the public. That means testing the capabilities of their systems, assessing their potential risk, and making the results of these assessments public. Second, companies must prioritize the security of their systems by safeguarding their models against cyber threats and managing the risk to our national security and sharing the best practices and industry standards that are necessary. Third, the companies have a duty to earn the people's trust and empower users to make informed decisions labeling content that has been altered or AI generated, rooting out bias and discrimination, strengthening privacy protections, and shielding children from harm. And finally, companies have agreed to find ways for AI to help meet society's greatest challenges, from cancer to climate change, and invest in education and new jobs to help students and workers prosper from the opportunities, and there are enormous opportunities of AI. These commitments are real and they're concrete. They're going to help industry fulfill its fundamental obligation to Americans to develop safe, secure, and trustworthy technologies that benefit society and uphold our values and our shared values. Let me close with this. We'll see more technology change in the next 10 years or even in the next few years than we've seen in the last 50 years. That has been an astounding revelation to me, quite frankly. Artificial intelligence is going to transform the lives of people around the world. The group here will be critical in shepherding that innovation with responsibility and safety by design to earn the trust of Americans. And quite frankly, as I met with world leaders, all the G7 is focusing on the same thing. Social media has shown us the harm that powerful technology can do without the right safeguards in place. And I've said at the State of the Union that Congress needs to pass bipartisan legislation to impose strict limits on personal data collection, ban targeted advertisements to kids, require companies to put health and safety first. But we must be clear-eyed and vigilant about the threats of emerging technologies that can pose, don't have to, but can pose to our democracy and our values. Americans are seeing how advanced artificial intelligence and the pace of innovation have the power to disrupt jobs and industries. These commitments are a promising step, but we have a lot more work to do together. Realizing the promise of AI by managing the risk is going to require some new laws, regulations, and oversight.
President Biden in the White House Roosevelt Room, and standing beside him, the presidents and CEOs of the 7 technology companies making the commitments today on artificial intelligence development. President Biden also saying that he'll be taking executive action on AI in the coming weeks. New York Times article has this: the White House offered no details of a forthcoming presidential executive order that will deal with a bigger problem: how to control the ability of China and other competitors to get a hold of the new artificial intelligence programs or the components used to develop them. That involves new restrictions on advanced semiconductors and restrictions on the export of the large language models. These are hard to control. Much of the software can fit compressed on a thumb drive. The Times article continues: an executive order could provoke more opposition from the industry than Friday's voluntary commitments, which experts said were already reflected in the practices of the companies involved. Wall Street today, the Dow up 2, NASDAQ up 1, and S&P down 30. The U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo said in a CNBC interview today that she still plans to visit China later this year, despite the reported Chinese hacking of her department's emails. She's one of several senior U.S. officials whose emails were hacked by, according to Microsoft, an organization based in China. Others on the list: the U.S. Ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns, and the State Department's Assistant Secretary for East Asia, Daniel Crittenbrink. The Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, was asked about this today by NBC correspondent Andrea Mitchell.
Now, China has hacked Nicholas Burns, our ambassador's unclassified emails, and our envoy to Asia's emails, as well as we previously learned the Commerce Secretary. And I am told reliably by former cyber officials and other experts that 90% of the government's business is done on the unclassified, in the unclassified space. So they were able to learn in a novel way, which was very alarming, a lot about our business. Is there some indication that this was going on for quite some time because of how novel their approach was? That they could learn our strategy as you were approaching your important reestablishment of relations on your big trip to Beijing?
So first, you're exactly right. I can't speak to the direct impact of any particular incident. I can say that the incident in question affected only our unclassified system. As soon as we, actually, at the State
But that's
Department
a big
detected
deal.
it.
The unclassified system is
So
huge.
we now have an ongoing investigation that will determine the impact. As soon as we detected it, which goes back some time, we took immediate steps both to make sure that we were strengthening our protections and defenses, of course reported it immediately to Microsoft to make sure that they were doing everything possible. And as a general matter, I've had opportunities to speak directly to Chinese counterparts about the deep concern we would have over anything targeting the U.S. government, targeting U.S. companies, targeting U.S. citizens, and the fact that we'll take appropriate action if we need to in response.
Are you concerned about our vulnerabilities here?
This is a constant effort, as you know, as we all live in cyberspace. So much of our life is in cyberspace. Of course, it's a constant concern, and there is an ongoing effort, quite literally every single day, to make sure that all of our systems are as strong and protected as they can be.
But isn't this a basic attack on our sovereignty? Where do you draw the line?
Again, what we've had occasion to share more than once with China is the concern that anything targeting the government, targeting citizens, targeting companies is a real concern for us. And we have in the past, we will in the future, as necessary, take appropriate action. Look, I can't say more than that at this point, especially since we have an ongoing investigation. We need to learn the full impact, even as we've taken steps to make sure that our information is protected.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Andrea Mitchell, NBC News chief foreign affairs correspondent at the Aspen Security Forum, held by the Aspen Institute in Aspen, Colorado. A story in Politico, 2 House GOP committee chairs are launching a probe into Ford Motor Company's agreement with a Chinese battery company, prompting renewed scrutiny into U.S. corporate links to China amid a boom in domestic clean energy manufacturing. Chairs are questioning alleged ties to forced labor and whether the jobs created under the deal will flow to China. That from Politico. And now to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. A story from Reuters. Russia pounded Ukrainian food export facilities for a 4th day in a row on Friday and practiced seizing ships in the Black Sea in an escalation of what Western leaders say is an attempt to wriggle out of sanctions by threatening a global food crisis. The attacks on Ukraine's grain, a major part of the global food chain, followed a vow by Kyiv to defy Russia's naval blockade on its export ports after Moscow's withdrawal this week from a UN-brokered Safe Sea Corridor agreement. That reporting from Reuters. The United Nations Security Council in New York City held an emergency meeting about Russia's withdrawal from the grain deal. Here is Linda Thomas Greenfield, the U.S. ambassador to the UN.
This Wednesday, the Kremlin unleashed missiles and drones on Ukrainian ports, killing and wounding civilians and destroying 60,000 tons of grain. 60,000 tons of grain. According to the World Food Program, that is enough to feed more than 270,000 people for a year. This week, Russia also announced that all ships proceeding to Ukrainian ports in Black Sea waters will be considered potential carriers of military cargo, which could have been avoided with the inspections that were provided under the initiative. And just last night, reports indicate that Russia carried out yet another round of attacks in the Odessa region. Russia is waging war on the world's food supply. It is waging war on the poor at a time when needs are so dire, and you've heard that people are angry and people will die. And the United States has information that the Russian military may expand its targeting of Ukrainian grain facilities to include attacks against civilian shipping in the Black Sea. Our information also indicates that Russia laid additional sea mines in the approaches to Ukrainian ports. We believe this is a coordinated effort to justify any attacks against civilian ships in the Black Sea and lay blame on Ukraine for these attacks. After more than 500 days of President Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it's easy to become numb to Russia's campaign of cruelty. But we cannot become numb. This is not normal. This is not the behavior of a responsible country, of a permanent member of this council. This council is charged with maintaining international peace and security. but Russia has upended peace and security around the world. Its actions fly in the face of everything this council stands for.
The U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, at today's UN Security Council emergency meeting in New York City. Russia's Deputy Ambassador to the UN, Dmitry Polyansky, also spoke, saying that Russia withdrew from the grain export agreement because the promise of allowing exports of Russian grain and fertilizer was not fulfilled. You're going to hear the voice of the UN interpreter.
Main component of the deal was the Russia-UN memorandum on the export of Russian agricultural products. Not a single of its provisions was essentially implemented over the past year. Given the historic role of the Russian Federation in terms of leading grain exporters in the world, it is clear that based on the package deal that we expected exemptions from the discriminatory approach to us by countries in the West who imposed unprecedented sanctions against us, effectively attempting to organize a blockade against our producers. This was important, not in our interest, but rather the interests of countries in need throughout the world, poor states. The fact that U.S., London, and EU sanctions formally do not apply to food and fertilizer, in fact, had no significance. We are talking about major barriers to our export, the lifting of which, or at least providing working exemptions for which, is something which nobody had any intention of doing.
That's the interpreter for Russia's Deputy Ambassador to the UN, Dmitry Polyansky, at today's UN Security Council meeting in New York City. A story from Moscow Times: Ukraine's counteroffensive to recapture occupied territories is failing even with Western military support, Russia's President Vladimir Putin said Friday. He told a meeting of Russia's Security Council today it's clear the Kyiv regime's Western curators are disappointed with the results of the so-called counteroffensive. There are no results, at least not yet. And the Times article goes on, without providing evidence, the Russian president claimed that tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers have been killed and wounded in the offensive. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was interviewed today virtually by CNN's Fareed Zakaria. He was asked about Ukraine's counteroffensive against the Russian military positions in eastern Ukraine.
The Ukrainian counteroffensive seems to be going more slowly and has many more difficulties than people might have anticipated. Can you tell us from your perspective why you think these difficulties are, why do you face these difficulties, and what do you need to try to overcome them?
Thank you for the question. Really a very relevant one. I would just like to draw your attention to the change of rhetorics worldwide, and I'm glad to hear that. Now we're discussing the counteroffensive in Ukraine. Ukraine is not backtracking, but progressively liberates its territories, which is very important. Last autumn, our servicemen had a powerful operation, and then they started building new brigades. Really, time matters. We did count on the time to be used to prepare counteroffensive activities, and it was in the press among the experts. We did have plans to start it in spring, but we didn't because, frankly, we had not enough munitions and armaments and not enough properly trained brigades. I mean, properly trained in these weapons. Still more that the training missions were held outside Ukraine, but still we started, and this is important. And because we started it a bit later on, it can be said, and it will be shared truth, understood by all the experts, that it provided Russia with time to mine all our lands and build several lines of defense. And definitely they had even more time than they needed. Because of that, they built more of those lines, and really they had a lot of mines in our fields. Because of that, a slower pace of our counteroffensive actions. We didn't want to lose our people, our personnel, And our servicemen didn't want to lose equipment. Because of that, they were quite careful about the offensive actions. Still, I would say that we are approaching a moment when relevant actions can gain pace, because we are already going through some mined locations and we are demining these areas.
The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, through an interpreter, part of an interview with CNN's Fareed Zakaria, who was at the Aspen Institute's Security Forum in Colorado. Also at that forum, in person, discussing the war, 3 U.S. senators who are all in favor of continued U.S. support for Ukraine, 2 Republicans, Jim Risch of Idaho and John Cornyn of Texas, and 1 Democrat, Chris Coons of Delaware. Here is Senator Risch explaining why he thinks the U.S. must not abandon Ukraine.
Ronald Reagan spent 8 years trying to bring down the Soviet Union. He was successful. Not only did he bring it down, all those countries got their independence and freedom. Most of them took it. But when it came apart, 4 countries came out of the Soviet Union nuclear armed. One, of course, was Russia, one was Belarus, one was Kazakhstan, and the 4th one was Ukraine. At that moment, Ukraine was the 3rd largest nuclear power on the planet. It's a policy of the United States then. It's a policy of the United States now. It's always been the policy. It's a great policy that as few countries as possible have nuclear weapons. So what did we do about it? We sat down with the Ukrainians on December the 5th, 1994 in Budapest. And we said, look, Ukrainians, you guys shouldn't have nuclear weapons. Why don't you give up your nuclear weapons? And we can't do that. We're right on the border of Russia. We're in a bad neighborhood. We got all this stuff going on. We said, listen, don't worry. We'll defend you. And we put it in writing. And you know what the Ukrainians did? They gave up their nuclear weapons. And so here we are today. We have not only a moral obligation to do this, we got a legal obligation to do that. For all you lawyers in the room, you know what a contract is when, number one, it's in writing, but secondly, when one party asks another party to do something and they do it in exchange for consideration. So there's that reason. Obviously, it's the right thing to do is another reason. And one of the most important reasons is, if you think she isn't watching every single thing that goes on as far as our commitment to see this thing through, you're badly mistaken. He is watching this, and I have reason to believe that for a fact, very, very closely, and watching every utterance that comes out of the United States Congress and out of the administration and out of the American people as to what kind of a stomach they've got to see this thing through. That we committed to do. So, when this started, I said, give them everything that shoots, other than nuclear weapons. I said, give them clusters, give them the HIMARS, give them the ATACMS, give them everything short of nuclear weapons. Give them F-16s. I said, give them F-16s because you remember we fought a little uptick in both Vietnam and in Korea. The Russians gave MiGs to our opponents there, trained the pilots, and flew against us. It's time to return the favor, for crying out loud. I'm tired of hearing about escalation. Stop talking about escalation. If you don't escalate, you're going to lose. I want Putin to wake up in the morning worried about what he's going to do that's going to cause us to escalate, instead of us wringing our hands and saying, oh, we can't do that. Look, everything I said we should have done at the beginning, they've done now. God bless them. I wish they'd have done it a year ago. Thank you.
Senator Jim Risch, Republican from Idaho, ranking member on the Foreign Relations Committee, also a very senior member on the Intelligence Committee, speaking today at the Aspen Security Forum in Aspen, Colorado. Washington Today continues in a moment.
When citizens are truly informed, our republic thrives. Get informed straight from the source on C-SPAN. Unfiltered, unbiased, word for word. From the nation's capital to wherever you are. Because the opinion that matters the most is your own. This is what democracy looks like. C-SPAN, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast wherever you find your podcast and on the C-SPAN Now mobile app. Next, British politics. The story from Reuters. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's governing Conservatives lost 2 strategically important parliamentary seats on Friday, but unexpectedly retained former leader Boris Johnson's old constituency in a setback for the opposition Labour Party. There is a national election expected next year. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, was interviewed in Uxbridge, England, site of the party's only victory.
Prime Minister, new Lib Dem MP for Somerton Frome, Sarah Dyke, talked about the circus of chaos of the Conservative government. How much of the bad results, not in Uxbridge, but elsewhere in the country, the huge swings against you, are the result of the chaos under Boris Johnson and Liz Truss? And how much of this is on you? And after 13 years, aren't people just fed up of the Conservatives?
Look, mid-term by-elections are rarely easy for incumbent governments. These are no different. And look, the reality is the circumstances of these by-elections are far from favourable. It's a reminder to politicians that we need to focus on what matters to people and not be distracted by what's going on in Westminster. And if you just look at what have we been doing over the last couple of weeks, we've been making a major difference to people. The inflation numbers we had just the other day show that our plan is working, easing the burden on the cost of living. We had an announcement of billions of pounds of investment in our auto industry. One of the largest investments in decades, going to create thousands of jobs. We announced a long-term workforce plan for the NHS, welcomed by over 40 NHS stakeholders, so we can train more doctors and nurses here at home, and we passed our Stop the Boats bill, one of the toughest pieces of legislation to ensure that we can stop the boats. That's what we're doing. We're getting on and delivering people, and that's what I'm going to do all the way to the next election.
Prime Minister Rishi Sunak interviewed today in Uxbridge, England. Joining us now from London is C-SPAN's producer in Great Britain, Peter Knowles. Thanks again for being on Washington today. What is the takeaway from these 3 by-elections in the U.S.? We call them special elections to fill vacant seats in Parliament.
These by-elections, these special elections were pretty awful for the Conservatives, with the exception of Uxbridge, where the Prime Minister had gone. There are local circumstances there. The Labour mayor of London is wanting to bring in and to extend a tax on older polluting vehicles, which is extremely unpopular in the outer suburbs. And the Conservatives were very successfully able to ride that tide of opinion and retain that seat that had belonged to Boris Johnson. So that was a kind of upset. But the other 2 results showed extraordinary swings against the Conservatives in the southwest of England in favour of the Liberal Democrats, of whom we've heard very little in recent years, but they are on the way back as the third party, certainly in England. And the absolutely amazing numbers in a rural constituency in the north of England, where Labour were able to overturn a majority of more than 20,000 in a single seat, and that's unprecedented. So although the situation is that you always get upsets and nasty surprises for the governing party in these special elections that are held in between the general elections, these were pretty big on the scale. And they fit with the opinion polls. They sit very closely to the opinion polls that for some time now have been showing Labour doing really well in public opinion and the Conservatives doing pretty badly. So there's not much cheer for the Conservatives. And their one success, the one in Uxbridge, the Boris Johnson's old seat, where we heard Rishi Sunak speaking, well, that will actually help the Labour leader in terms of making the case that he's making very fiercely with his own side, that Labour can't just go around promising to put up taxes and thinking that nobody's going to care or notice. So it may even work to strengthen his position, because he's been having quite a tough time lately. There was a tremendous amount of pressure on him to abandon certain welfare spending limits that the Conservatives have brought in, and he's refusing to do so. That's been very unpopular with his own side, but maybe his position is that bit strengthened because he can say, look, if you just put up taxes, then people respond.
Prime Minister Sunak is now heading into a parliamentary summer recess. He's been in office for about 3/4 of a year. He's got a general election we expect next year. So what does he have to do to try to improve his standing?
He's got 5 priorities, but they're quite difficult ones to achieve. Inflation is beginning to go in the right direction, but it's from a very high point. So Rishi Sunak is saying, well, I'm just going to concentrate on the basics, on competence in government and restoring a sense of confidence and competence around the government, which has been badly shaken. So the comparison that pretty much everybody is making is between the present period and the middle of the 1990s, when the Conservative Party got a poor reputation for being tired in office and for sleaze. And that reputation led them into a catastrophic election when Tony Blair, the new Labour moderniser, arrived with an overwhelming majority. So that's what he's struggling with. And the problem is that his own side have started to believe in that narrative. I mean, most Conservative MPs that you speak to think they're going to lose. And that's not an easy place for a Prime Minister to govern from. But he's got several moments coming up when he can do something. A reshuffle is on the cards, so the Cabinet, there'll be some names in and some names out, and that could happen very soon. That's might be successful, but the argument against it is that there's far too much chopping and changing at the top in government, and that the senior government ministers don't have long enough in one office. But anyway, that's coming, a reshuffle. The next thing would be a party conference speech, and that can reset things. It can also blow up in your face. It can go pretty badly wrong, but it is a very public moment and that's in October, to establish who you are and what you stand for. Then the next one along, of course, is a state opening of Parliament, and we now know the date for that, the 7th of November, and the King's Speech, something that we've only ever known as in our lifetimes as the Queen's Speech. This will be the first King's Speech since 1951. So that is an opportunity to set out a legislative programme for the remaining year that's available to this government, because it has to have an election at the very latest by January 2025. So this will be the last state opening and new legislative programme delivered by the King in Parliament. So there are these big moments coming up, but the big but is these by-elections, these special elections, they really cause trouble, and they rarely go well for the government, and almost certainly there's going to be more. There's lots of possibilities, and the chances are in the next few months we'll see more, and each one of them is really difficult to defend against opposition parties that can throw all their energy into these elections and get, as we've seen last night, quite remarkable results out of them.
We're talking with C-SPAN's producer in Great Britain, Peter Knowles. President Joe Biden was in England just a week ago, meeting with the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister and the President were at the NATO summit in Vilnius. How much does foreign affairs impact what the voters are thinking now, or is it all domestic policy in Great Britain?
I'd say it was pretty much all domestic policy. I was there in Downing Street, saw the President's arrival, and a good-humoured affair it was. From the point of view of the waiting photographers and reporters, who were above all actually fascinated by the behaviour of Larry the cat in Downing Street, who enjoys sitting on the red carpet and was scooped up away from being a trip hazard as the President arrived. But that NATO summit doesn't really, I mean, it just doesn't appear anywhere in the opinion polling. And that's partly because there's next to no difference between the Labour policy, the opposition Labour policy, and the Conservative governing Conservative Party's policy on Ukraine, the largest of the foreign policy issues. They think pretty much alike, that it hasn't caused rifts. So foreign policy is at the moment, whereas it was under Jeremy Corbyn leading Labour, it was an area of very great division between the major parties. Not so at the moment, not so. So it's all domestic.
Peter Knowles, C-SPAN's producer in London. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're listening to Washington Today. The U.S. House Oversight and Accountability Committee will be holding a hearing next week on unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAPs, also known as UFOs. Republican committee members held a preview news conference this week. Congressman Tim Burchett of Indiana said the focus will be on getting to the truth, which so far, he says, has been kept from the American people.
Last year, the House Intelligence Committee held a hearing on UAPs. They brought in some Pentagon bureaucrats who only had two answers to the questions they were asked. I don't know, or that's classified. This hearing is going to be different. We're going to have witnesses who can speak frankly to the public about their experiences. We've had a heck of a lot of pushback about this hearing. We've had members of Congress who fought us. We've had members of the intelligence community and also the Pentagon. Even NASA backed out on us. There are a lot of people who don't want this to come to light. I've even tried to introduce an amendment to the Federal Aviation Administration Reauthorization Bill, and all that would do would require the Federal Aviation Administration to report UAP sightings by commercial pilots to Congress. I was told the intelligence community shut it down. This is ridiculous, folks. They do exist or they don't exist. They keep telling us they don't exist, but they block every opportunity for us to get a hold of the information to prove that they do exist. And we're going to get to the bottom of it, dadgummit, whatever the truth may be. We're done with the cover-up.
Congressman Tim Burchett, Republican from Indiana, at a news conference yesterday with other Republican members of the House Oversight Committee. NBC News reports that Congressman Burchett said the committee will be hearing testimony from three witnesses, a former U.S. naval official, a former Navy commander, and a former Navy pilot. The official and the commander both claim to have spotted UAPs, and the official, the first person, claimed that the U.S. has retrieved intact and partially intact vehicles of non-human origin. The committee's hearing is scheduled for Wednesday, July 26, 10 a.m. Eastern. C-SPAN will be covering it. Also, there's a pending bipartisan amendment to the Senate version of the National Defense Authorization Act that would seek to declassify UFO-related records. The Senate will continue work on that bill next week. Congress is not in session today. They return for legislative business next week, but the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer tweeted on Thursday, "The Senate passed my resolution celebrating the 50th anniversary of hip-hop. I was honored to work with hip-hop giants KRS-One and DJ Kool Herc to ensure the birthplace of hip-hop, 1520 Sedgwick Avenue, was preserved and celebrated." Senator Schumer spoke about this on the Senate floor.
Over the decades, hip-hop has transcended language, race, age, both geographic and socioeconomic barriers. Many people can attest to the fact that hip-hop actually changed their lives for the better, gave them purpose and meaning. I know many of them myself, many of whom are New York City and Bronx residents. So hip-hop is great. It's a uniquely American art form that quickly blossomed into a global movement. And we are proud today that this resolution honoring the 50th anniversary of hip-hop has passed.
As the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, on the Senate floor on Thursday. During his remarks, he thanked Republican Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana for helping with this resolution. And in the House, Congressman Jamal Bowman, Democrat from New York, who's introduced his own resolution commemorating the 50th anniversary of hip-hop. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word to get the stories Washington is talking about sent to your inbox every day. Subscribe at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night and weekend.